Humans first arrived on these shores about 1250 AD, braving the hazardous seas to discover a truly new land. When the first Polynesians came, they arrived at their new home bringing many of the foods they had known before: taro, kumara, breadfruit, and yam. Meat was scarce, and the Pacific rat, or kiore, was an important food source. When they arrived, they found abundant moa, ground-dwelling ducks and geese, and vast numbers of forest birds, including kereru. Over many generations, Maori have developed a strong relationship with their pigeon.
Our people were ever careful to maintain the Maori, to maintain the life force of the Kereru, so that it ensured that there would always be a plentiful supply of Kereru season in, season out. The Kereru was a prized food source in Tūhoe. A feast would not be a Tūhoe feast if it did not have Kereru on the tables. My grandmother was very good at using shotguns, and I would accompany her, and I was taught at a very young age that my job was to ensure that the Kereru did not hit the ground, because when this bird was at its fattest, then if they were to hit the ground, the Kereru just broke up. They were that fat. After a few growlings for missing the target, I became quite good at catching the Kereru. So my grandmother would shoot it with a shotgun. I'd look at where she was pointing, and I'd run under the tree, and as it came down, it would hit the branches, and my head would be going as it hit the branches, and then I would grab it. The Kereru was a voracious eater. When it needed food, it ate. It didn't care what was happening around it. It was just a big scrum on the tree, and it didn't matter if there were guns blazing at them. They just kept eating. And then there was a great need for it to drink. And the Maori had studied the habits of the Kereru over many, many years and noted this habit of the bird. And that's where this contraption came into use. It noticed Waka Kereru full of water, and it landed, and it would take a drink. The fella maintained the vigil to ensure that it was always full of water and to set the nooses. When the Kereru bent down to drink, its head would go through one of the nooses, and in order for it to drink, it took a mouthful of water, and then it raised its head so that the water would flow down. And as it raised its head, the noose tightened, and it went down and took another swig of water and raised its head, and the noose tightened further. And then when it went to fly off, it strangled itself, and the fowler would come back and then collect the Kereru. Beautiful though Kereru is, men were persuaded not to partake of Kereru. Male children were actually fed the fat of the Kereru at a very young age, so that by the time they grew up, they were so nauseated by the fat of the Kereru that it was almost repugnant for them to eat that part of the Kereru. The preparation of the Kereru in my time was to boil it. The other method, of course, was to tahu the Kereru, or to preserve it by roasting, and they were deposited into this taha Kereru. As you can see, it's very ornate and adorned with the feathers of the Kereru. My preference would be to eat the Kereru fresh, because to eat it the preserved way meant you had to bone it, and that was the task of women. They used their thumbs to do that. That was part of the ritual that ensured that the Maori of the Kereru was maintained, that you used your fingers. You didn't use a stick, you didn't use metal, you didn't use knives or forks. If you came into Tūhoe and you dared to use a knife or a fork to open the Kereru or to cut pieces of the Kereru, then Tūhoe would frown on that. Kereru was part of our culture until some 2-3 decades ago, when the reality hit Tūhoe that maybe we ought to refrain from taking birds as much as we used to. When I was growing up, it was nothing to take birds up to 100. That was a culture that was very hard to do away with, and therefore, we've looked at other ways of trying to keep that culture going without taking the birds.
Europeans began to make their presence felt with the arrival of Captain James Cook in 1769. He brought with him a philosophy that was to dominate for the next 2 centuries. 3 things factored in the decrease of Kereru in New Zealand forests. The first was the introduction of predators from Europe, especially stoats and weasels in 1890. They were brought over to control rabbits, but have also been highly effective at killing and eating nesting birds and their eggs. Second was the destruction of their habitat through clearing. The burning that was started by Maori was intensified by the Europeans. Third was the large-scale hunting of Kereru until they were protected in 1921. These words were written by one of New Zealand's first resident conservationists, the station owner Herbert Guthrie Smith.
I have heard an observer describe how, as a boy at Norsewood in the 70-mile bush, he recollects pigeons so plentiful that, on certain favourite perching trees, their weight was sufficient to break down smaller boughs.
In 1880, Guthrie Smith sailed from Scotland to New Zealand and took over the lease of Tūtira, a large sheep station in central Hawke's Bay.
Some spots on earth inspire in their owners a very special affection, an occult sympathy betwixt the elementals of the soil and those who touch its surface with their feet.
Always fascinated by nature, he would spend entire mornings concealed beside a nest, carefully observing birds' behaviour. In 1914, he began a work that was to earn him a place in New Zealand history, a massive book chronicling 4 decades of natural history. Tūtira, the story of a New Zealand sheep station, was published in 1921.
Young pigeon on artificial nest, brought up on porridge and wearing a bib. The pigeon, though safe in New Zealand as a species, has become rare on Tūtira. For the last quarter century, a couple of pairs have bred about the homestead. On shrubs growing at right angles to the faces of cliffs, the silly platform of sticks which serves for a nest is fairly safe from rats, weasels and prowling cats.
Herbert Guthrie Smith died on the 4th of July 1940 at Tūtira after completing revisions for a new edition of his famous book. 2,000 acres of the original station were left in trust to the people of New Zealand. Even though Tūtira was published the same year Kereru were officially protected, their populations continue to decline to this day. We lose as much as 20% every 10 years from areas where predators are found. In 100 years, the Kereru could be all but lost from these places. Fortunately, there are people willing to give them a hand. Karen Wiley has a special love of Kereru.
Keeping your head covered ensures that we don't get too upset. I love native birds. I love all birds, and it was just my way of putting something back that was helping them in a positive way. Native Bird Rescue Wellington Trust was founded in December 2003, and we formed it so that we could apply for funding because it's quite expensive looking after native birds and providing accommodation for them. I used to do all birds but decided that I would prefer just to do native birds because then I could concentrate on those. Kereru are beautiful, little blue penguins are full of personality, tuis are real clowns, wax eyes are just sweet. Last year we had just on 200 birds, of which 50% were able to be released successfully. So that was a really good year. Kereru that come in are generally coming through all year round. There's a predominance of them at this time of the year and in autumn. We get them mostly with injuries caused by them flying into windows. In 20 to 50 years' time, I'd like to see Kereru as just a general part of our landscape, flying into gardens, feeding from the trees, for people to enjoy watching them. They're beautiful birds. They are quite intelligent, and they deserve to be back where they belong.
Zoos also have an important role to play in conservation, safeguarding genetic diversity and preventing endangered species from becoming extinct. Wellington Zoo keeps Kereru for both conservation and education.
The zoo has a number of breeding programs. They are to do with kiwi, also kereru, Campbell Island teal, and a few other natives, and it varies on which species is in demand. He's stunning, isn't he?
Okay, so your normal examination of every animal really goes top to bottom, so it's the easiest just for yourself to remember. I usually start with the beak, so you have a look how symmetrical the beak is. You have a look at the tongue. With birds, you always, especially with pigeons, you look if there's some sort of plaque around the larynx and the epiglottis. You have a look at the eyes, just see if there's some sort of discharge, some asymmetrical, swelling or something like that. And then, of course, the pectoral muscles, so the actual flight muscles, is often the easiest way in a bird to establish the condition of the bird. So is he in good nick, good condition? Feel for the elbow joint here, the shoulder joint. Just see also, of course, the whole time you check the feathers, beautiful here, very, very good condition feathers. Everything's there, no fracture, normal movement. Especially if you get birds in that have been found on the road, they very often have got fractured wings. Quick check of the whole leg, just to see if everything's alright. A normal bird has this normal reflex, so they actually have to grab when you put something in the foot. If they don't do that, then something's wrong with the nerve system around the legs. Perfect!
Yeah, we're ready.
Healthy bird. Good.
We have two pairs of Kereru here. The female is slightly smaller and she's a lot older. She's actually about 20 years old. She's actually the oldest living Kereru in captivity. He's slightly younger and he was brought to us through rehabilitation. He had a broken wing and was injured for about 2 months, and we rehabilitated him to the point where he can fly, but he won't be able to sustain himself in the wild, so we have to keep him in captivity.